Thank you very much. So I carry on the theme of recovery, but I want to talk about this in a kind of maybe slightly more biological way and referring mainly to life on land. I think it's a commonly understood observation that the extinction event at the end of the Permian in some way reset the evolution of life in a pretty major way. And before the event, one has what's sometimes called the Paleozoic fauna in the sea. After the event, the modern fauna. But the question is, how long did this take, and was it a rather simple replacement or perhaps more complex? So the end-Permian mass extinction, about which we haven't heard as much as we might have done in a meeting of this kind, has been very well studied, and the kinds of model for causation we've heard about for other events, and the sort of lip volcanism, and I won't go through the detail of that. Observing before and after can be done at a regional and local scale. And of course, at the local scale, it's rather impressive. You can be collecting through marine sections and finding dozens, if not hundreds, of species representing reefs, and the rock in many cases, this is from South China, is a bioclastic limestone just made up of the richness of fossil debris. And then within millimeters, you're into the post-extinction, and all of that is gone. And it's really extraordinarily dramatic. And this is well known, the 4 or 5 surviving species. On a regional scale, of course, this is well known also to have been documented, summing up the extinction of the ranges of more than 500 species, and showing peaks of extinction towards the end of the Permian and in the earliest Triassic, with something like 90% species extinction at each of those levels. So this is just background to establish that the event is well studied. Also well known is that the Earth system did not recover promptly, and so it's clear that there were environmental perturbations which have been well documented for at least 5 or 6 million years. So this from Jonathan Payne, 2004, much reproduced, the carbon anomaly at the PT boundary, but then repeated anomalies occurring subsequently through 5 or 6 million years and into the middle Triassic. And the scale of those carbon and oxygen anomalies indicate extraordinary global warming. And a consequence of that was highlighted by Sun and colleagues in their paper in Science in 2012, that raising temperatures around the equator by 15 degrees expels a great deal of life. They documented it for life on land, as well as certain fishes, but it would be interesting to document this further for invertebrates. With my colleague Massimo Bernardi, who's here today, we looked at this in some more detail, because one of the problems with this study was the limited number of terrestrial faunas. We're looking at a very inadequate geographic coverage. So by adding footprint data, it was possible to test and confirm this idea that life fled from the tropics. And again, these are not the best of fossil records because of the sporadic geographic and temporal occurrences, but at least it's something. And they showed a shift. The data are somewhat different for footprints and skeletons, but in all cases, there's a definite shift from the late Permian to the early Triassic in terms of the mean value, which you can see highlighted there. So a shift of 10 or 15 degrees away from the equator. This is the normal focus of recovery, looking at it in a somewhat geological context, and I'm going to go beyond this then to look at it in a more macroevolutionary context in a second, highlighting the perturbations on land and the chert gap in deeper oceans, the coral gap, or hiatus at least, in shallow seas, and a coal gap on land coal gap there. A coal gap on land where forests disappear, and this is sort of highlighting in a stratigraphic way the seriousness of the event. This has been documented now in China through vast sections of rock that span much of the Triassic through 3 or 4 kilometers of rather continuous deposition. I just show you some field localities just very briefly. We've worked at a locality called Lo Ping in the mid-Anisian, which has produced some exceptionally preserved fossils, including soft tissues, but an interesting mix of marine and terrestrial organisms together, allowing a kind of reconstruction of an early recovery fauna. And one of the, if you like, positive features of the extinction event was the origination of new groups of organisms. So this is what I'm going to look at a little bit more in a second. These represent, although they may not look like it, modern type organisms. The Neopterygian fishes, which are faster moving, less heavily armored than the Paleozoic types. Marine reptiles, including ichthyosaurs and placodonts, which may not seem very modern, but they were a new level in food chains. And lobsters and other malacostricans and so on, replacing the trilobites and Paleozoic forms. And these pictures are so great, I just have to show them. I apologize if you've seen them before. Done by Brian Chu, who is a paleoichthyologist who admits himself he wastes far too much time in painting, but his pictures are so fantastic. These represent some of these Chinese faunas. So this is the kind of fossil documentation of what was going on in the Triassic. Allowing a kind of rather simplistic rebuilding of, or understanding of, understanding of how marine faunas are rebuilding by addition of new layers as you move through the Triassic. And secondly, yielding a great deal of information at these exceptional locations indicated by the vertical red lines. So this is early, middle, and late Triassic shown in color. It's not scaled to time, and the late Triassic carries on much further. But this reminds us that even though there may only be 5 exceptional biotas in China yielding these amazing fossils, we can join the dots by imposing a phylogeny. So the phylogeny is an independent and strongly evidenced hypothesis of relationships. And even though we only have spot occurrences, nonetheless, this can give us a great deal of information on a larger scale. And likewise for the marine reptiles. So we've actually seen in a few talks today already, downfield, and a number of others, people applying these new numerical methods in macroevolution. And we benefit from the fact that we have increasing rich databases. We've seen those in talks from Alex Dunhill and various others today, the paleobiology database. Massive improvements in the precision of dating. Huge improvements in trees, we've seen some of those already, and of course the computational tools. And you've seen these kinds of super trees already. When we did this one of dinosaurs, 500 species a number of years ago, we felt exhausted and thought, that's it, that's the limit. Now 10,000 species are not unusual, but there we are. That kind of scaling, and you've seen the benefits in Dan Field's talk. I'm going to skip through this very quickly because if you're not familiar with it, I don't want to linger, but this is a justification for a lot of the methods that people are now using. They're called collectively the comparative method, and it allows you to, it makes sure that you don't treat each species in your comparative analysis as if they are independent, because they are not. They are linked by a phylogenetic tree. And in this case of 6 hypothetical species, you're not exploring 6 possible trait transitions between these 2 characters in red and blue. You're maybe just exploring 1 trait transition when you understand the relationships. And I'll just show you this little sequence of body size and metabolic rate. It might seem not unreasonable to plot a regression line like that, and that's what would have been done up to about 1990. End of story. You've got the relationship between body size and metabolic rate. However, if you understand that the red dots are rodents and the yellow dots are deer and cattle, then you might think, oh, right, maybe this is a bit different. Actually, you got the relationship 100% wrong. And understanding phylogeny gets it, well, maybe it doesn't get it right, but let's say it gets it more defensible. So that's just a little graphic cartoon explanation of why we bother about these kinds of things. And it all began about 30 years ago with ways to calculate ancestral states, by Joe Felsenstein, illustrated here, and to test models of evolution against essentially random walk. So all of these red zigzags, which could be coin-tossing experiments, whatever you like, positive, negative, none of these indicates a trend. These are all random walks. So that's another facet of this, the need, and Mark Patek was doing this in his talk at the beginning of the day, the need to discriminate your pattern from random. And then there are many kinds of models that may emerge, and I won't describe these in any detail, but we'll have a look in the real cases. So this takes us away from an assertion that used to be made against paleontology, that all you can do is to reconstruct patterns. These methods actually allow us to extract these kinds of models of evolution. Have we got a trend? Have we got an early burst of evolution? That sort of thing. The final bit of background is just to introduce the word disparity, which we use in the sense of the range of form. So again, some of you might have been thinking, well, it's a little bit arid simply to be documenting numbers of species when we have so much other further information, particularly in complex organisms, about diet and modes of life and other information that we might wish to draw out. And so disparity can encompass all of those features of form. So I want to show you 3 case studies for recovery of life in the Triassic. The first one concerns the dicynodonts, which famously in the form of Lystrosaurus here, was a great survivor of the PT mass extinction. It belongs to this group of herbivorous reptiles, which were widespread before the event and became widespread again after. And so that in cartoon spindle diagram form, we have what can be called a bottleneck, that they were diverse. This is simply a count of the numbers of genera. Before the event, they reduced to only 2 or 3 that crossed the boundary. They remained relatively at low diversity through the early Triassic, and then exploded again into a new sort of high levels of species. But what's going on there? There's 2 things to look at. This is partly survival of Paleozoic holdovers, so this feeds to a theme I'll be emphasizing towards the end, that actually modern life didn't recover and emerge in the early and middle Triassic, but perhaps in the late Triassic, because we still had a fair number of Paleozoic holdovers or survivors, like the dicynodonts, that actually could recover. So these are not what Jablonski called dead clade walking, which survived but didn't lead to anything. These did lead to something, but not in the longer term. The data are actually quite good. Of course, in the face of micropaleo studies, we have to bow down. We can't in any way approach that. But nonetheless, the data sets are not entirely hopeless. So these are the species according to timescales of about plus or minus 1 million years. We at least have quite robust phylogenies, and that highlights the bottleneck with only 2 or 3 lineages surviving. Here is Lystrosaurus, actually. It is a dead clade walking. It does not lead to anything else. But these lineages here do radiate. So you could say that's all fine. They've expanded and so be it. However, if we look below the surface and look at disparity, that was not the case. So a hypothesis here could be that if you pinch out a clade and only 2 or 3 lineages then expand again, you actually reduce the amount of morphology and perhaps the amount of ecological adaptation. That seems to be the case. So in a morphospace plot, which you can read geometrically, and you can compare the area occupied by different groups, these are the Permian dicynodonts here, occupying this amount of space. These are the Triassic ones, occupying a considerably reduced amount of space, about half. But in fact, this one here is one of the dead clade walking. This is Myosaurus. So if you remove that, you can see that all of that expansion of dicynodonts in the middle Triassic here is occupying a very tight zone of morphospace, meaning that they are all very, very similar. They may have been diverse, disparity was low. So by reading these 2 metrics, diversity and disparity, we're learning something that was otherwise hidden. The second case study are the cynodonts, which include the ancestors of mammals. These were mainly carnivorous forms. Their phylogeny through the Triassic, here's the PT boundary here. They originated in the latest Permian, but never became very diverse or abundant. And then they diversified through the Triassic into the Jurassic, and giving rise to the mammals here. So we have the range chart, and we can document disparity again in terms of numerous measured characters. And this actually highlights something that, here's the PT boundary, lower, middle, and upper Triassic. Diversity is low, and it continues low, and then rises in the middle Triassic. But interestingly, disparity goes ahead. So this, we're beginning to discern, and I won't take this any further, a decoupling of diversity and disparity, which was unexpected, because a standard Darwinian theory of evolution would say they probably would go hand in hand. As you get more species, you get more morphological diversity. Not necessarily. And a disparity first pattern like this is actually more common than people had expected. The third example, the age of dinosaurs. I knew it was late in the day, so I thought I just had to try and wake you up. Can be tracked back to the PT boundary. And the first inklings of this came 5 or 6 years ago, when people began to find that the oldest dinosaurs were not exactly at this level at about 230 million years ago in the Carnian, but there are just traces of dinosaurs, some elusive skeletal evidence and some footprint evidence that many people would say is quite unsure, but nonetheless, we're getting fossil evidence that is pulling the origin of dinosaurs right back. But in that they are so rare, that's telling us something else, that maybe dinosaurs did originate earlier than we thought, but they didn't diversify or become ecologically important at that time. And a study a few years ago by Sukias and colleagues, they were looking at models of evolution here. So the dinosaurs are actually originating somewhere here, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger through the Triassic. And at the same time, the therapsids, including the cynodonts and dicynodonts, are actually getting smaller and smaller until you end up with the mammals. But the question that Sukias had, and this is the first of our macroevolutionary model examples, was, can we show that the rise of the dinosaurs was a real trend, a driven trend, where they're actually evolving faster than would be expected by a random walk? Remember the sort of trumpet of red lines. And in fact, they couldn't find that evidence. So although the sizes are changing, they're what they called a passive change in size. Yes, they're getting bigger, but we can't say this is Cope's rule or this is some particular trend. We did a different kind of study of the same thing and came to about the same conclusion, looking at morphospaces of late Triassic dinosaurs versus Crurotarsi, which are all the other archosaurs. And certainly when the dinosaurs first became visible, they were occupying quite a tight piece of morphospace, about a quarter or a sixth of that occupied by their so-called competitors. And we tracked the amount of morphospace through time. So here are the dinosaurs getting more and more disparate. This is the range of morphology through the late Triassic. Here are their competitors. They're also getting more disparate. We would have expected some sort of evidence of interaction. Maybe you could say there's a sort of slowing down of rise in disparity. It's not very convincing, though, that the old model that the dinosaurs, after they originated, they beat everything up because they had big teeth and they were standing upright and they were fantastically successful predators. It actually took the extinction at the end of the Triassic for the switchover to happen, where the disparity of this clade diminished massively as a result of the end Triassic extinction, and you're left with just the ancestors of crocodiles. Dinosaurs tentatively are moving across into that area of morphospace, but again, not very fast. They've got their chance, and they're still being a bit sluggish. So the final bit is now the timing of this rise of the dinosaurs, and when it started, it did happen rather quickly. So we're now tying this to the Carnian pluvial event that you heard about from Jacopo earlier, and that dinosaurs were, whether we look at them as a proportion of specimens or genera, so this is not numbers, this is a proportion within well-documented faunas. So this is looking only at cases where we have hundreds of specimens and we can get a figure. And they do seem to rise rather rapidly. And we looked at proportions in faunas through the Triassic, And the blobs, this is the Triassic, the PT boundary is somewhere in here, about the middle here. And the size of the blobs is the numbers of specimens in the faunas, or the numbers of genera. In this one, the numbers of specimens here. So we had a look at the proportions of archosauromorphs, and they're sort of rising. And then there seems to be some sort of switch at this point indicated by the star, rising and going across, rising and going across. We wanted to test that independently because you could eyeball it and just fit two lines and say there is a break point. But there are methods of doing this a posteriori, which means you don't tell it where the break point is, you tell it there is a break point, the numbers are crunched, and guess what? It came out with a break point at 232 million years ago. So in terms of the switch of proportions, this is a kind of ecological measure happening right at the Carnian pluvial event, it seems. This has now been dated in a paper which we hope to hear about shortly, written by Massimo Bernardi and colleagues, where he's been able to tie marine dated sections of the Carnian pluvial event, indicated here by the green bar at the beginning of the Tuvaluan, with footprint faunas, ichneufaunas. And before this, there are no dinosaur-like footprints. After this, there are plenty. And so it's possible in rare cases like this to tie the terrestrial fauna to a well-dated marine section, which we've done, and I've rather confidently put it as if it's going to be published. Well, we're just waiting for the second revision to be accepted. And so to finalize on this, and this is just about it, finished, it seems that several groups of organisms that were important on land in the Triassic, vertebrates, showed different responses to the changing world at the beginning of the Triassic, the consequences of the devastating end-Permian mass extinction, and the ecological opportunities that were provided. And we've seen a bottleneck in the holdover dicynodonts, which eventually dwindled and disappeared. The disappearance of the dicynodonts gave opportunities ecologically for new herbivore groups, and these were the dinosaurs at that point. They stepped in and they took over ecologically, seemingly, as we were able to show, by really quite a major change in the nature of the faunas after this Carnian pluvial event, this lost and just being rediscovered mass extinction. And then there was another burst of radiation somewhere in the early Norian, the rise of these herbivores following the extinction of the dicynodonts, and then another burst at the end of the Triassic, where various competitor groups disappeared. So to summarize, and I don't know whether this was plotted accurately or inaccurately, I found this thing on the web. It highlights the Cambrian fauna, the Paleozoic fauna, and the modern fauna, and it shows the switchover actually happening after the PT boundary. And whether that's an artifact of a badly plotted diagram or whether they meant it, I don't know. But the evidence we're finding, at least for terrestrial faunas, and it may be true of marine as well, I think a lot of groups got going in the early and middle Triassic and then really came to the fore after this Carnian pluvial event. So this seems to be a second punch that finally got rid of the last Paleozoic forms. You get decent reefs and neopterygian fishes, fast-swimming fishes, marine reptiles in the sea, and on land you get the dinosaur-dominated communities with mammals, with lizards, with various other modern groups at the same time. So a sort of double whammy, and then finally the modern faunas 20 million years into the recovery. Thank you.